Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Trump rescheduling cannabis, elections in Chile, and the fate of white millennial men under DEI. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Trump won 2 presidential elections promising to make America great again, and now he is poised to deliver. According to reports, Trump is prepared to issue an executive order that will reschedule cannabis. So this isn't exactly a legalization, but it's something that changes cannabis's kind of official status under federal law so that cannabis companies can get access to major banks, really so the cannabis business can grow much, much larger. And we know that nothing will make America great again, like letting businessmen profit off the mass sale of cannabis, which will improve the lives of the young people who use it, which will make our streets safer and more pleasant. So Trump is doing what he said. He is making America great again. 3 cheers for Donald Trump.
You know what's funny is this is another one of these things that I've changed my mind about. Anybody who's read any of my work knows that I've got a libertarian streak. And I used to be in favor of assisted dying. I changed my mind. And I've also changed my mind about this. And very, very recently, actually. I have always tended to be of a mind that consenting adults should do as they judge. Important emphasis on the word judge is best for them, and that requires a lot of careful thought. Not just do what you feel, but actually what you judge you can handle. However, I recently spoke at a drug summit, an international drug summit, which is very much outside of my expertise, but what I was there to talk about was what will not work for stopping the global spread of drugs, which is something that's been continually suggested, which is more mental health support in schools. I'm not even joking. People think that this enormous global gazillion-dollar industry can be stopped if we just supported more mental health in schools. So I was there to talk about how that's not going to work.
There are very few things that wouldn't be improved or stopped by just insisting on the importance of mental health.
Right? There's just so many underqualified psychology graduates. Come on, we've got to give them jobs. Anyway, so that's what I was there to talk about. But as I was sort of listening to these discussions, I was absolutely floored by how bad the problem is, how intractable it is. The first speaker gave this talk about like how much money is involved, and I honestly reevaluated my life choices and began calculating, well, geez, man, just one drug run, you're set for several lifetimes. It was like, when you're up against that, it's so difficult to put in disincentives. It's absolutely mad. Anyways, so I realized that this idea that I had clung to for such a long time of legalization of all drugs, really. I mean, this is like the standard sociological point of view, and me not being an expert in the area of drugs, it's something that you learn about and you think, yeah, that sounds good. Crime is capitalism is criminogenic, and you create the crime by creating the law. So get rid of the laws and let people judge for themselves. Let the governments regulate it, whatever it might be. I realized that this was so incredibly utopian because the entire world would have to legalize drugs. Because what winds up happening at the same time, essentially, because what winds up happening is if you have one country that legalizes, it just becomes a hub for all of these criminals and so on to pass into all these other countries where it's not legal. And so you just create these horrible problems. And then in the countries where it is legal, because it is illegal elsewhere, it attracts all these horrible, corrupt individuals, these drug runners, these gangs, and organized crime. And yeah, legalization seems to cause way more problems than it solves, unless you have a kind of worldwide simultaneous legalization, which strikes me as utopian. So going to Trump's executive order, it seems to me, particularly with the experience of Canada, that one thing that I noticed was when we downgraded the seriousness in the public mind, because in our mind now you have this idea of like the law isn't just what is allowed, it's what is good. And so then marijuana just became this thing where it was like you couldn't criticize it. You can't say it's bad. Like people are like, whoa, that's a bit mad. This is a great thing. So you can't. It becomes very, very difficult to talk about why it's bad. And then all of the people I laughed at when I was a teenager who said marijuana is a gateway drug seem to be right, because I was watching friggin' 50-year-old people at a wedding shovel mushrooms into their mouths. Like everybody starts doing mushrooms all of a sudden. Like all of these other drugs suddenly seem to me to be much more prevalent. And as marijuana becomes no big deal, you have more illicit drugs and more illicit drug use. Now, I can't back that up with statistics. That's just my anecdotal understanding, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's backed up by stats. So yeah, it's
a disturbing lack of rigor from Ashley Frawley on the Compact
I told
podcast.
you, I started this by saying I'm not an expert in this area. I can only bring to it what I think won't work. But yeah, so that's kind of the conclusion that I've come to, and I really have to. I haven't written about this or anything like that, so I'd have to really give it some thought if I were to write about it. But yeah, I've kind of come around to the idea that I don't know. I don't want to be like a doomer or something like that, but it just seems so impossible to deal with because the amount of money involved, the incentives involved. Legalizing it doesn't seem to work, but neither does enormous like the military industrial complex coming down on this. Like, I don't know. Maybe you have, Geoff or Matthew, maybe you have better, understanding of solutions than I do. But my instinct is that, I don't want to smell marijuana on the streets and watch people shovel mushrooms into their mouths. Like, maybe we could legalize, but also say, hey, this is bad. This is a bad thing for you, and not be weird, merry White House moralizers for doing so.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, there are a few things that are interesting about this. One, it seems to signal certain things about Trump and his sort of coalitional politics. I would say it's connected to the backing he received from people like Joe Rogan, a noted stoner and promoter of both weed and psychedelics. And, particularly this kind of young men demographic, the sort of podcast bro demographic, which is also the sports gambling demographic. So it really is this demographic that's connected to various kinds of vice that have been legalized in recent years. And so I do think that is an interesting element of this, where I think he's in some ways doing something that's statistically pretty popular. I think overall it's become a pretty popular policy, even if there maybe is a bit of backlash here and there. And specifically is a way of maybe shoring up some of his youth support, some of his young male support. And then it's also a money thing. I'm not sure if this is still the case, but a few years ago I was reading about how former House Speaker John Boehner, himself a noted bon vivant, though mostly known for his penchant for cigarettes and red wine, as far as I recall, and he, I believe, was the son of a bar owner. So, kind of into the pleasures of life. But the point is, he, after his congressional career, became a major lobbyist for the cannabis industry. So there is a kind of way that, just the lobbying element of this has worked its way into the Republican Party behind the scenes. And you have a number of key figures within the Republican Party who have become big enthusiasts of this, simply because it is a new area and growing area of big business. Big weed is an area of big business. So that's an interesting, I'd say, kind of coalitional and sort of behind the scenes aspect of this. the other thing that and related to that I think is kind of interesting is, when the legalization first went through in California, I happen to have a friend who was from Mendocino County and actually whose family were cannabis farmers, which, Mendocino, if people don't know, is one of the epicenters of the of marijuana farming in the U.S. Mendocino and Humboldt counties in far northern California. And basically, he said his whole community of people he grew up around, who were part of this illegal industry, and in fact, his own father had served time in prison for this. But nonetheless, all these people in his community were against the legalization. And the simple reason they were against it is that they knew it would immediately lead to a consolidation of these giant sort of agribusiness conglomerates, and that small family farms of the sort that they had been, many of them running for generations, obviously with difficulties of, attendant to criminalization, had nonetheless knew that their whole livelihood was basically going to be shot because they wouldn't be able to compete in this new environment. And that, indeed, as far as I understand, has been the case. And then the final thing that's interesting to me, sort of anecdotally, is that it does seem obvious. I was a somewhat regular weed smoker in high school, so obviously the stuff was around. It was pretty easy to get. And I do sort of basically accept the argument that the whole way that things were run back then was quite bad, because, to be honest, it was a mostly pretty, I would say, pretty harmless. I'm spouting cliches of the era, but I would say it was mostly a pretty harmless drug, especially compared to alcohol, which I saw have much worse effects on friends and peers at the time. But at the time, smoking a joint, I was talking to a doctor about this recently. A joint might have sort of 5 milligrams of THC in it. Whereas today, a sort of standard gummy that you get at, a legal dispensary is going to have 10. Sometimes they have considerably more than that, as well as it's just harder to, when you're smoking a joint, it just takes time to consume it. And so it's harder to get really, really high. Whereas now with these gummies, you can just pop them like candy. So it's just much easier to, I think that there have been a number of adverse effects that have been tracked and so on. But, the thing that strikes me is that in the era of legal weed, it does seem that like the substance itself has just become much more dangerous than it actually was when it was illegal. But I suppose my own take on this is that, there are plenty of problems with the new paradigm, and that there were also problems with the previous one. And so, probably the best approach, going forward would be something like what's happened with tobacco, which is basically that it's both heavily regulated, heavily taxed, and heavily stigmatized. And so it exists. It's not criminalized, but it basically is subject to a great deal of oversight. And unfortunately or fortunately, the only way to do that really is to change the national legal status of the substance and make it something you can regulate through the FDA or ATF, these federal regulatory agencies. And so that really is probably the most positive way forward, is just kind of heavy regulation, as well as stigmatization, as well as the emergence of kind of just new kind of social norms regulating it. We've seen a significant change in how tobacco is treated in my lifetime. So that's probably the most likely scenario, rather than a kind of return to the prior paradigm of prohibition. So, but I do think that the interesting thing here is that the Republican Party has in some ways become the party of vice under Trump. And, the question is where the impetus for this sort of, I suppose both stigmatization as well as kind of regulatory effort will come from, because one doesn't really imagine it likely to come from the Democratic Party either. So I'm not really sure at this point.
It will come from blue states, I think. Massachusetts right now just had a ballot measure approved to restrict the use of cannabis. I've talked to people who are involved in the organizing efforts around this, policy guys, journalists, and they don't expect it to succeed, but they view it as the beginning of an effort very much like the one that has led to cannabis legalization. Or you could just look at other social movements like gay marriage. So you just kind of put things on the ballot. You lose, but you raise awareness. You kind of normalize the idea that law and culture could move in this direction. But Massachusetts, which is not the reddest state in the union, is where this is beginning. And I think that one reason for that is probably that some blue states have embraced this earlier than red states have done. My own native Nebraska still restricts cannabis. So there are still some red states that have yet to embrace this new brighter tomorrow that Trump is prepared to bring. But I think the combination of maybe an earlier negative experience from blue states, along with the sense that the Democratic Party is comfortable with certain kinds of social regulation, frankly, and that its voting base is contains a lot of upper middle class professionals who, even if they've shifted to the Democratic Party from the GOP, which was their previous home, still maintain certain senses of what a healthy society looks like. I think for that reason as well, blue states are going to be where you begin to see some of the early pushback against this, even as maybe some red states kind of take a last stand. So yeah, I think though, as I kind of said in my facetious opening, I mean, this move from Trump really strikes at the heart of his kind of claim to greatness as an American president. I think of the 2016 inauguration, this American carnage stops now. Not really. No. I mean, the cannabis rescheduling began under Joe Biden, and Trump is not prepared to bring it to completion. So, this whole notion that Trump stands against the uniparty, that Trump resists American carnage. We are, ending these drug deaths that are killing our boys. Cannabis isn't fentanyl. There's a real difference there. But this idea that the government's going to stand against these socially destructive forces, this move makes it a lot harder to sell that story.
I was going to say, I do think it's worth connecting to the sports gambling, which is another area where, and Compact covered this with a piece from Christopher Caldwell 3 or so years ago. And there's been subsequent coverage, but I think that was one of the earliest pieces to kind of pick up on its significance. And again, I think it is something where you see the sort of vice lobby and the vice contingent within the Republican coalition having made it very difficult for, or being something that really Trump and his allies have embraced in that context. And again, it's this kind of young men podcast bro contingent that they want to keep in line, but at the same time, basically say, well, everything's kind of shitty, but you can have your weed and you can have your sports gambling apps, and your life will kind of suck, but you'll have these various things to make it slightly less unpleasant.
And if you talk to anyone who runs a small business that employs relies on the labor of working class men, they talk about drugs and drug use so much. such a big issue in terms of labor. So, the notion that we're going to close the borders, we're going to stop H-1Bs, all this, but meanwhile we're going to turn kind of demoralization, kind of deculturation of the American people, their kind of degradation through kind of extensive and powerful drug use, make this into the biggest possible business. I mean, that really runs counter to that idea, because it's going to make it harder to find working class labor in America, and it's going to absolutely increase pressure for immigration. I mean, when I was young and was doing construction work in Nebraska, there's always a kind of implicit hierarchy on the job site. And I was, I worked as an apprentice electrician, and we electricians, we knew that we were the best, the very best. A classic electrician joke: what do you need to know to be a plumber? Water runs downhill and paydays on Friday. Well, plumbers were next on the hierarchy. And then you have kind of carpenters, concrete guys, and drywallers. And drywallers had this reputation of being kind of druggies. I mean, nice, the ones we worked with, nice guys, good guys. I actually, went to school with the son of the kind of main drywall crew we would work with on a lot of jobs. But yeah, they were, kind of looked down on in sociological terms for their indulgence in drugs and other things. That's outmoded. Drywall crews are now Mexican, where I'm from. There just aren't white drywallers. That's no longer the case. And so, this, I mean, there's no coherence in this kind of policy that's emerging of, oh yeah, we're not gonna bring in any labor, but we're just gonna flood America with drugs. Like, that's look, it's not gonna work. People need drywall in their homes. Somebody's got to put up the drywall. Maybe you don't like drywall. Maybe you think it's not as nice as plaster or whatever. But somebody's gonna put it up. So that's just another issue here that I want to hit on, to kind of highlight just how insane this is in terms of the kind of Trump movement's claims to being a positive force and an important force in American life. America's not the only country in the world, obviously. God didn't put us at the center of the universe, at least not for all time and in all ways. So, Geoff, what's been happening in Chile?
So Chile has just elected, probably it's safe to say its most right-wing president since the end of the Pinochet dictatorship in 1990, and that is Jose Antonio Cast, who is a brother of one of the so-called Chicago boys, one of the young economists trained by University of Chicago luminaries like Milton Friedman, who oversaw the economy under the Pinochet regime. And Jose Antonio Cast's brother Miguel was the president of the central bank under Pinochet. So he has that kind of background. He's also Catholic and socially conservative, while being, a sort of hardcore free market neoliberal type who defends the legacy of the Pinochet economic reforms. And so
a true poster, basically.
Right. So I think, there are a few things that, people are comparing him to Milei. It is worth noting, while he was known as something of a firebrand, particularly compared to the somewhat, there was a long period in which the Chilean right had to, I'd say kind of policed itself to ensure that its main representatives didn't say too many nice things about the dictatorship, and made clear they had criticisms of its human rights abuses and things like that. And so similar to what happened with Bolsonaro in Brazil, you suddenly had a leader who was willing to kind of break that taboo, or a candidate who's willing to break that taboo and say, no, we needed those tough military guys in charge to crush communism and bring prosperity to the nation. And so that was a significant paradigm shift. Although I think Kast, as far as I can tell, is in keeping with Chilean politics, which tends to be very kind of demure and polite. Doesn't quite have the personality of a Bolsonaro or a Milei. He's much more polite and concerned about norms. And in fact, he fended off a rival from further to the right, named Johannes Kaiser, which, it's funny that all these Chilean right wingers are Germans. Sort of awkward. Kast's father was in fact, did in fact serve in the Wehrmacht, and later migrated to Chile. So, sort of awkwardly, there is a kind of connection there, just as, under Pinochet, there were kind of these bizarre escaped Nazis who got up to no good. You can read about some of this in the work of Roberto Bolaño. But in any case, so it represents something of a paradigm shift, similarly to Milei or Bolsonaro, but it does seem to be much more polite and in keeping with the studied, moderation that tends to characterize Chilean politics. Also true of Gabriel Boric, who was the president for the past 4 years, who, despite being a sort of student, left-wing radical firebrand, I think was ultimately kind of domesticated into this this very polite and institutionalist type of politics that tends to characterize Chile, which, other than the coup in '73 and one other major disruption in 1893, has had basically a sort of peaceful democratic transfer of power that characterized its post-independence history, unusually for South America. And so, I think the thing that's interesting about this is that the beginning of this trajectory was really that, Pinochet obviously imposed these radical free market reforms, but by most accounts, including of people who are relatively sympathetic to that approach, the sort of Chilean model, as it's called, was really perfected under the center-left democratic governments that succeeded Pinochet. That you had a series of kind of, essentially third way, sort of social democratic with neoliberal tendencies, governments that, largely held power through the 90s and into the 2000s. And, were able to oversee, extremely impressive growth and, just economic numbers that everybody in the world seemed to envy and regard as one of the greatest success stories of the sort of end of history, peak neoliberal era. And yet, all of that came crashing down in the 2010s because you had a series of protest movements culminating in 2019. And at that point you had, really millions of people out in the streets of Santiago, a city that, is roughly the population of New York, a little bit smaller. So, something equivalent to like a quarter of the city's population was, taking to the streets. So this was truly an astonishing level of unrest. And it did force something that, interestingly, people on the American left often like to call for, which was a rewrite of the Constitution, which was seen as a sort of referendum on the model that was imposed, because the Constitution dated back to 1980, and so it was imposed under the dictatorship. And one of the conditions of the return to democracy was essentially keeping the Constitution, which partly meant keeping the economic structure that was created back then intact. And so basically you had really, what were initially protests about cost of living, and also about various of these key neoliberal initiatives, such as privatized pensions, which people may recall George W. Bush in his ill-fated attempt to privatize Social Security, cited the Chilean pension system as a model for this. And in fact, it turned out quite poorly, and people were dissatisfied with it. That was one thing. Another was a kind of sort of Milton Friedmanite voucher-based education system. And so there are various things that people really rejected and were unhappy about. But it is worth kind of reading more deeply into what was going on then. And I recommend this book, which I reviewed for American Affairs a couple of years ago, called The Chile Project by Sebastian Edwards, because it kind of goes into this question of, to what extent is this sort of malaise or discontent that started emerging in Chile in the 2010s, understandable in purely material or economic terms, and to what extent does it have to do with a rejection of the kind of society that had been created in Chile, and a kind of discontent with, more sort of immaterial, perhaps spiritual or perhaps kind of, social factors that, that are hard to quantify. Because if you look at the numbers, Chile was it wasn't booming in the way that it had in the 90s and 2000s, but it certainly was doing better than many of its peers, even when at the point at which this series of protests burst out. And so anyway, all that is kind of interesting. And then the amazing thing now is that you have the election by a very large margin of a candidate who basically is promising a restoration of the very approach that seemed to have been rejected in the late 2010s. And so you really have the whole cycle completing itself with this bizarre sort of reaffirmation of the very thing that was originally rejected. So, people should read Juan Rojas's piece, which is largely focused on, what went wrong with the left-wing government, which was really supposed to bring about a model, an alternative new model to replace the one dating back to the dictatorship, to make a more radical break with the Pinochet economic regime, and why it failed. So people can read that. And then for a more in-depth account, which goes back a couple of years, but the kind of background history is all still relevant, people can read my What's the Matter with Chile, which I published in American Affairs in 2023.
The Chile case, is interesting and important because it was really, Borsch's government was really looked to by progressives in the U.S. and elsewhere as a very important kind of test case and model. And Geoff, you mentioned people who hoped to rewrite the U.S. Constitution, who still hope to do that. You have, Asita Nuanevu, a millennial writer who has a book out about our need to kind of rewrite the Constitution because we don't properly have a democracy now, and we need to bring one about by rewriting it on socialist lines. And Boris was the model for that. There was a lot of progressive attention on the country. There was a lot of kind of progressive money poured into the country to enable that, and it just totally failed. And I think that's very something that progressives who hope to have similar change here in the U.S. should probably consider and think on. Also, just because there was a lot of progressive money put into the country without an actually successful change in the Constitution coming about, it's also, I think, a reminder that to people who talk about color revolutions or kind of globalist manipulation of national polities, there are real limits to that. I mean, you can spend a lot of money on something, and that doesn't mean it's gonna come about, because voters will have gut check moments. So, I think Chile is one there's one place where the kind of 2010s era kind of or early 2000s era progressive dream went to die.
One other thing that's kind of worth noting here is that the narrative about it on the international left was so much that, really the Pinochet project was this kind of you were bringing up the color revolution idea, this sort of right-wing narrative of, international progressive donors kind of pushing their agendas through these astroturfed, uprisings and so on. And the Chilean unrest of the 2010s was very clearly not that, although it did eventually attract donations from and support from abroad. But similarly, I would say I think there's a flaw in the narrative around Chile being, well, we had this democratic socialist project, and then the evil U.S. imperialists came in and crushed it. And so if we can just get the boot of American imperialism off our necks, we can have democratic socialism again. That was just never right, because the Allende project was very internally contradictory. It produced a lot of problems within the country, which was very fractured and divided at the time. And so, it's not that there aren't foreign entities, attempting to exert influence here. It's not that the U.S. wasn't involved in supporting the coup, but fundamentally the impetus for the coup had to do with the failure of the Allende project and the sort of chaos that it brought about, and the contradictions that it couldn't resolve. And I'd say similarly, we're back in that situation, that the sort of the left once again proved kind of unable to resolve the contradictions that it sort of unleashed and attempted to capitalize off of unsuccessfully. And that this whole talk of like, well, it's just like the foreign imperialists versus the authentic Chilean people who want socialism is just so silly and so unhelpful.
Yeah, and for so long there's been this attempt to kind of project onto South America, well, we can't have socialism here because our workers are all total dupes and, brainwashed by capitalism. But over there, these people, that's where it's really at. And then they go and vote wrong also, which is just a wonderful lesson that, if you can't, people don't revolt because they have like a moral problem with capitalism. They will revolt against any government if their lives are not getting easier, if their lives are getting more difficult. That's just a reality. And for too long, the left has thought that you could just sort of moralize politics and sort of, stand in front of the powers that be and tell them this is wrong and all would be well. That's not the case. And so any kind of government's going to get a whipping if you can't make people's lives materially better. And that just seems to be the basic lesson.
We don't just cover the news, we make it, right? That's our new tagline. With Jacob Savage's essay, The Lost Generation, fair to say it's been a sensation. More than 10 million views on Twitter, one of our tweets promoting it. The chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, drew attention to the issues raised in the essay, as did the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. Elon Musk, that sage, also weighed in. Yeah, quite a response to the piece. Geoff, let me center your voice here. You're one of our resident white male millennials. What have you made of the response?
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, it wasn't entirely unexpected, because Jacob's previous piece for us, The Vanishing White Male Writer, was also a bombshell. And so, it's clearly tapping into something, and not just the topic, but the particular way that he approaches it. I think not as somebody who's particularly, certainly not as a kind of conservative ideologue or a kind of crusader against affirmative action or something like that. he clearly comes at it fundamentally out of his own experience, and it has a sort of authenticity that's, I think, grounded in his own trying to kind of make sense of his own experience and that of other peers. And so, I think that's why it's sort of able to speak more broadly in a way that's something that's more kind of polemical and politically, targeted at, pushing a particular line might not. I do think, I would say, just speaking for myself as somebody who, is sort of part of the cohort that he describes, clearly there are ways that it's unpleasant and uncomfortable to kind of think about oneself in these terms. And yet, at the same time, throughout the 2010s, you were kind of told that you had to. And so there was kind of that weird disjunction where you were kind of repeatedly told, no, you are this thing. And, the dominant tenor of the public discourse became, this is like the bad group of people who we can safely sort of crap on and say bad things about as a group. And so obviously, I sort of recognize that, and it's helpful to, have somebody kind of lay it out empirically, but also narratively. It certainly made me, to be honest, kind of living through the 2010s, it wasn't necessarily a way that I, chose to or wanted to kind of narrate my own experience. But in retrospect, it certainly, has some illuminating aspects. And, I think for me, it's also interesting because my father is a retired professor. He came from, a sort of middle-class background, but not, I think he came from a background of like, whatever, his father was a doctor, his family went to state schools. So not particularly prestigious, but, very solidly middle class. And, then he sort of managed to get into the Ivy League, and then, had a very sort of charmed career as a, boomer, tenured white male professor. And so obviously, for much of my own, less successful path through academia, I was sort of comparing myself to him and thinking about what was available to him, compared to me. And obviously, like, it's, I'd say the sort of figures who get the most criticism in Jacob's piece are figures who, occupied those, sort of white male boomers and Gen Xers who kind of occupied those positions. And I will say, I think it's probably fair to say, without without being too harsh on my dad, that he, probably was kind of that description of somebody who, I think would have largely gone along with various kinds of diversity and diversification initiatives and thought that was important and morally valuable. And, but it's interesting to me because he also kind of knew my own path. And I think on some level, he just somehow wouldn't have seen the connection or somehow wouldn't have, I don't know, I'll have to ask him, but he somehow wouldn't have seen the connection, between the fact that there were just obviously less opportunities, part of them just having to do with the contraction of faculty hiring overall. But obviously within that contraction, there are certain groups who are going to be more favored than others. So yeah, so it was interesting, the generational frame, in part because it was quite sort of personally significant to me thinking about it. And then a final thing I'll say is that I hadn't thought about this that much, but my longest employment in academia, was a full-time and non-tenure track position at NYU, so relatively elite and wealthy university. And I guess the interesting thing about that was that, it was quite a large department. it was, if you talk to like tenured faculty about our sort of category of faculty, what they would usually say was, or if you said like, oh, I teach in this program or this department, what they would say is, oh, so you're really on the front lines, huh? And what they meant was, essentially we were doing the bulk of undergraduate teaching, particularly of first year students, of freshmen and sophomores. And, they, part of their sort of tenured status meant they didn't really have to do that much of that sort of teaching. And so, we were on the front line, so it was a relatively low prestige and heavy teaching load kind of position. And it ended up being essentially a kind of second best option for people who didn't get tenure track positions, because it was full time. It did have benefits. It did have a certain amount of job security despite not being tenured. But the interesting thing about that was that within that department, there was a kind of there was an imperative to diversify, to recruit more diverse faculty, but it was particularly difficult to fulfill because, essentially, quote unquote, diverse faculty who would qualify for that position were actually in a much better position to get a more prestigious job. So in other words, there was kind of a great deal of hand-wringing about, not being a diverse faculty, but it was also particularly hard for us to recruit, sort of non-white faculty, essentially, because they were in a better position to, be recruited by, for more prestigious positions. So it was kind of a bizarre kind of middle space to be in, because you were kind of not at the top of the pecking order. And in some ways that meant that you were actually, that the department was less diverse, because the people who were kind of not able to make it through to the really desirable jobs were more likely to end up in that position, if you see what I mean. So that was kind of a significant part of how I spent, much of the 2010s, that I hadn't quite thought about in those terms, but this essay clearly kind of laid it out in a way that that made a lot of sense of it for me.
I was really curious what to hear your experience, because I know you're both millennial men. So, but I will say that I had like the complete opposite. Obviously, I would have a complete opposite experience, because I'm the people that this article is kind of suggesting benefited from this stuff. So I was absolutely 100% certain when I finished my PhD that it was going to be impossible to get a job. Like, I was certain of it. And I had a book contract with a good publisher, and I had done really well. My thesis was really successful. I had publications and stuff. So I was in a good position, but I was 100% certain I was not going to get a job. And I had 3 job interviews, and I got all 3 jobs. And now I'm kind of soul searching. Was I as good as I thought I was? Perhaps I ticked all the boxes. Although, to be fair, like, the one diversity box that I could tick in the UK probably doesn't mean anything to them. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I had such mixed feelings reading this. I have incredible, it's, awful, and everybody knew that this was going on, but to see it all laid out in such detail and backed up with evidence was just utterly shocking. The way that meritocracy was just sort of thrown out the window. However, while I was reading, you did get the sense, like, I, as a mediocre man, simply expected to coast through life, and I was shocked when this was not the case. And he kind of says, even the successful white men I spoke to understood that something had fundamentally changed. They expressed gratitude and relief, a recognition that success was contingent, easily disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. There was so much fragility to things going well in the first place, one tenured professor told me, that it's natural to think a slight perturbation would have meant things went worse. And I was just thinking, this is literally the first time in my life I realized not everybody feels this way. Like, this guy said this like it was worthy of note, that I have success and I fear it might be taken away from me at any time. I literally thought everybody felt like that. Surely, like, the fact that he actually thought that was worth saying was stunning to me. there are people in the world who are successful and just like, yes, this is where I'm meant to be. My life has unfolded exactly as I thought it would. I find that really shocking. I think this is a whole world I didn't know existed. Yeah. So the thing is, okay, I've said that, and I know I've painted a big fat target on my back, but yeah. So there were points where I was a little shocked at how much he just kind of thought that things were going to go well for him. But we shouldn't be fighting over the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table. And like this feeling of like Schadenfreude, where you see some of the responses to this, the overwhelming response has been positive. Like, oh, finally someone has said what I've been thinking. But there are people who are like, oh no, wah, wah, white man tears. Now you're feeling the pain we've all felt for all this time. We shouldn't be like squabbling with each other over the crumbs, as I was saying, the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table. And like we've all just accepted this situation that you're going to be educated and talented and have a lot to give to the world. But no, the pie is shrinking. Everybody just kill each other for the scraps. That's what we're doing. And I've seen it now online. There's all these like witch hunts now starting up. Oh, did you get your job from are you a DEI hire? Before this article, this kind of thing is starting to go on. And like, can we not see the bigger picture here? The situation in academia is awful. It's really bad. It's worth noting how bad it is. You're producing all these people with PhDs, and we can talk about the quality of the PhDs or whatever, but there's no space for them suddenly. You're hiring all of these adjuncts and so on, giving people like tons and a humongous teaching load and just offloading onto them for poor pay, people living in their cars and this sort of thing. This is a terrible situation. And yet we're meant to point fingers at each other. Well, you got the job. There's like 2 jobs and we're meant to kill each other for them. I feel like that's crazy. That's some Hunger Games stuff. Like, we need to have a conversation about this weird, horrible situation we're in, which is that we have education systems, and we have education systems that people 100 years ago couldn't have dreamed of. We're producing people that know things that, the average person 1,000 years ago, what was it? They knew as much as could be contained on a newspaper page. And now, the average person has like the sum total of human knowledge at their fingertips. And we're like, oh, this is horrible. We're creating this horrible, insecure situation for very qualified, intelligent people. I mean, I think the scandal is deeper than a lost generation of millennial men. It's a scandal of wasted talent of humanity just generally. And this is going to come back to haunt us, because think what we could be doing instead of this crap. Instead of like, he talks about like people doing these menial jobs when they were talented, and they're constantly doing this crappy like day job, hoping that they'll get to do the thing that expresses their creativity. What a loss. What a loss. Like, what are we even doing here? I hope we have I mean, I know it's not going to happen. I know what's going to happen next. We're all going to start pointing fingers at everybody as a DEI hire and all that sort of thing. But I wish it was like the beginning of a bigger conversation about where the heck we're going, because what a waste. It's sad.
So really, Savage, I think, wrote a great essay, and what makes it truly an essay and not just a polemic or a legal brief is the way that it makes the reader think of his own experiences. For both of you, you kind of think, okay, so what happened there? What was going on at the time, and what's going on now? It's not just how should we respond as a society, but what do I think about this? How do I feel about it? And Savage really writes the kind of thing that you would maybe expect to read in a, I don't know, established, prestige sort of, maybe kind of heterodox-ish outlet, or but a mainstream legacy paper, but it really couldn't have appeared in any of the legacy prestige magazines or journals, because they're all so implicated in this process that it would effectively be an essay saying, Department of Justice, please sue us. Open a civil rights investigation into what we've been doing and posting PDFs about. And I think, Savage, one thing that's great about, his essay and what he's doing is that he is speaking to that world, basically, to liberal America. And he's asking it, kind of, how do you guys feel about this? How to, is this what you wanted? And in that way, it really expresses a, it's, maybe, Savage isn't sure about, I think Savage isn't sure that his argument will be heard. He's not sure at all. But there is this hope that we can have debate across ideological lines. Not everything is enmity or just group interest. And it's I think it's good to have that kind of democratic faith which Savage displays. That's what we need to sustain this project. Obviously tempered by realism, and also just his sense that these big institutions do matter. A lot of Compact is itself a kind of startup publication or an upstart publication, recently founded with fewer resources, and we're able to do things like publish Savage's essay only with the help of our loyal subscribers and generous supporters. Thank you, and please become one if you aren't. But these big organizations really matter. Condé Nast, the New York Times, and no one is really building anything to replace them. Maybe the person who has come closest to that and has shown the most ambition is Barry Weiss with the Free Press. So I think Savage is right to say these institutions really matter. The University of Austin is not displacing Harvard anytime soon. So improving this country has to involve, yes, challenging these institutions and engaging in various forms of social confrontation, but also laying out arguments and allowing people to see certain realities and hoping to persuade others. Boy, I feel very kind of happy, clappy, and soft. I'm talking about the importance of civic persuasion, and maybe we can all get along. But I think Savage's essay is a great model of the belief that arguments, words, things that are written with kind of both intelligence and feeling can help to move people, and that's at the core of the best understanding of our political project, I think. So on that Sunday morning radio hour note, thank you, Ashley. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks to our producer, Stephen Adebato, another white millennial male we want to hold up here. And thanks to you, listeners. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.